The issue, from my point of view, with this bill is less the science, but has to do with what happens to all the children who don't have a choice, won't be vaccinated, and may be removed from school. Removed from school in terms of its impact on their mental health, in terms of their formal education, and some perhaps nutritionally for the kids who go to school and get breakfast, get lunch, etc.
One of the things this bill certainly does not address is the fact that the state of Connecticut offers a constitutional right to an education in the state of Connecticut. And we have seen the impacts of COVID over the past year on our children, how isolation and distance learning has impacted them. We are going through the process of trying to enhance education over the next 2 years with the federal money. And we are today potentially taking a vote to deprive a group of individuals access to that education. To us, that's not acceptable. It's something that the legislature should be addressing. So I think fundamentally there are people in our caucus that are concerned that if this bill passes as is, children will be thrown out of school next year. And so certainly there are individuals in our caucus who want to protect those children from being thrown out. But it doesn't fundamentally address the questions of what we do going forward as a state, and how the children who are unable to have a public education, how that education is provided to them. The bill is totally silent on that issue.
So I think it behooves us as a legislature to really think in a kinder and gentler way, and think about the impact upon those children who would be potentially removed against their will. Creates an issue even if they attempt to homeschool, if they have parents who both have to work, and many of you are probably in that situation, or where there's a single parent family and obviously that parent has to work, so how would they homeschool a child if they are not enrolled? So for me, that's been the crux of the issue, not so much the issue about the pros and cons of the science or vaccines.
This is that we don't know the number of children that are impacted. You know, we often hear that there's roughly 7,600 children that are exercising a religious exemption. That accounts roughly, 1.8% or 2% of the overall population, yet somehow the vaccination numbers are much lower. Well, the fact is that we have a number of children that are just non-compliant. They have not handed in paperwork, so we don't know whether or not they're vaccinated. If this is such an important public policy, the Department of Education and Public Health should be doing a better job of enforcing the laws that are already on the books. We have ascertained it could be upward of 20,000 children that are non-compliant. And so this bill, the scope, could be impacting upward of 30,000 kids in our educational system. So before these type of leaps were taken, we would have hoped that both the Department of Public Health and SDE would have looked at those issues, talked to the schools, and figure out how we bring everybody into compliance, whether it be through the exercise of a medical exemption, a religious exemption, or just handing in your paperwork.
Data concerning MMR, mumps, measles, rubella, measles being one of the most infectious conditions where you need a high community or herd immunity to make things safe for society. We are about, and you can check the numbers, but I believe about 96.2% in kindergarten and 98% for 7th grade, thus above the required 95th percentile. I think we are about 5th nationwide in terms of total vaccination rate. So that speaks volumes to the work that we do here in the state and our level of protection. But perhaps it allows us the time to pause and perhaps focus on education, because a big issue in the schools remains perhaps what the DPH would call non-compliance. Children who just are not vaccinated. They don't have a medical exemption, they don't have a religious exemption, they're just not vaccinated. So I think we have the time to focus on education, to try to get as many more children vaccinated as possible without removing them from school.
But ultimately what we heard from so many of those people are how the medical system is failing them. How they want to get a medical exemption, they think they're entitled to a medical exemption, but they can't get one. And in fact, at the federal level, the CDC guidelines are so restrictive that your baby needs to present an anaphylactic shock before you're entitled to a medical exemption. I'm very sympathetic to those families that might have had child number 1 have some sort of an impact to a vaccine, and yet child number 2 cannot get a medical exemption because they need to demonstrate some type of an allergic reaction before they can get it. Those are the failings, I think, at our federal level of those guidelines that are impacting these families. And what I will say is the bill does attempt to address that issue by looking at the contraindications of family members. And that's where I think we need to start moving as a state first to try to draw together the individuals who do not want to get vaccines and our medical community. And right now there's a huge wall dividing the two.
So I think there's time to educate. I think there's time to take a close look at the impact upon children educationally, how we would implement this. What would enforcement be? You know, if a school has a number of non-compliant kids, are they forced out? Are they disenrolled? Are they expelled? If they're enrolled, then do they have to go through an expulsion process, or are they just quote-unquote disenrolled? And I'm not an expert on the terminology in terms of getting into and out of the school system. But I think those are questions we haven't answered, and I think we need far more input from the State Department of Education, Department of Public Health, before doing this.
The bill does not have enforcement procedures. Given the fact that there's a constitutional right to an education, we've not heard from our superintendents. You know, I would argue that you cannot deny somebody without due process. So I'm not sure that this bill would result in children being thrown out. But the public policy being set today by this bill does imply that, and we're concerned. Yeah, I have no reason to believe that this bill doesn't have the support. It's been proposed for a number of years. If the amendment is called, I think it would get some Republican support because people are concerned. Otherwise, children would be thrown out of school next year. I think that is an overriding concern for every individual. Politics and policy aside, we don't believe any child should be denied the right to an education. So certainly there may be support to minimize the damage that is being done to our students.
There's a whole nother argument in terms of religious rights, and as a non-lawyer, I'm not going to discuss nor debate the legal constitutional issues with you because that's really not my strength, so I'll defer to the attorneys on that issue. There is the issue of parental control. Should parents have the ability to control what goes into their children or not?
It is not the role of government to question the sincerity of one's religious beliefs. And so I think it's a valid issue whether it affects 10 people or 1,000 people. I think there's a valid point to that. You know, unquestionably, the state of Connecticut is removing a religious right. And unlike California that did not have a religious exemption, this is a very different approach today than a state like California. Right now, we know the universe of children that are in school that are exercising religious exemption. And from K through 12, that number is around 7,600. If this bill passed with the amendment bringing it down to kindergarten, the individuals that would be impacted are those that are newly trying to enroll into school. That number hovers around, say, 800 students per year. So what this bill, the impact of this bill going forward, would essentially be disenfranchising about 800 students every year and denying those 800 children a right to an education. For whatever reason, this bill has been around for 4 years. Despite our attempts to try to negotiate the bill, the majority, the Democrats, have decided to take a sledgehammer to this issue as opposed to something more gentle.